So let's jump right into a question that honestly a lot of people struggle with, whether they've been reading these texts for years or are just curious. It's a tough one, but it's so important. Is the God of the Old Testament cruel?
And it's a completely fair question. We hear all about a God of love, but then you open the Old Testament and some of the stories are, well, they're shocking. This huge difference can be a major roadblock for people trying to make sense of it all.
So here's where things get really confusing for a lot of people, right? On one side, you've got this God who commands armies and brings down some pretty heavy judgment. And on the other, you have Jesus in the New Testament telling people to love their enemies. It makes you wonder, how can these possibly be the same person?
Well, one way to think about it is this. Our feeling that these acts are cruel often comes from seeing them totally out of context. It's almost like we're looking at one single, intense, confusing piece of a giant puzzle, without any idea of what the final picture is supposed to look like. Okay, so to get a real handle on this, we have to do something that's crucial for, well, pretty much everything. We have to zoom out. We need to look at the bigger picture, the history, the culture, the whole moral situation going on at the time. When we do that, a very different story might start to come into focus.
Let's take one of the toughest examples, the command to destroy the Canaanites. Now, the perspective here isn't that this was a sudden, aggressive invasion. Instead, it's framed as the final action of a judge, a judgment that only came after 400 years. Think about that. 4 centuries of waiting patiently for a deeply, deeply corrupt society to turn itself around.
And we're not talking about a small disagreement here. This judgment wasn't random. The context given points to a culture that had become, as it's described, depraved to the extreme. We're talking about things like child sacrifice and widespread horrific violence. So from this viewpoint, this wasn't an attack on innocent people. It was a final, drastic surgery to remove a cancer of evil that was threatening everything.
And here's something that's absolutely crucial to remember. Even in all this, the judgment wasn't a blanket condemnation. There was an escape route. Just look at the story of Rahab, a Canaanite woman who chose to act in faith. Because of that choice, she and her entire family were saved. It's a powerful signal that grace was available, even in the middle of all that fire.
This all leads us to a much deeper, more philosophical question. When we use a word like cruel to describe God, what standard are we even using? By what authority do we, as finite, limited human beings, get to sit in judgment over an infinite creator? This really gets at the core idea of divine sovereignty. The thinking is, just like an author knows the entire plot of a book from beginning to end, the creator has this massive overarching perspective that we, stuck on our single page, just can't see. The idea is that God has the right to act according to a plan that is perfectly good and just, even if it looks really confusing from where we're standing. I mean, look at the difference. Our view is trapped in this tiny slice of time, right? But God's view sees all of eternity at once. We're swayed by our feelings and our biases, but God is presented as perfectly just and holy. We focus on what's happening to one person right now, while God is focused on a cosmic plan that spans all of history. So our ability to judge is, by its very nature, incomplete.
And here's the real kicker. The argument is that the very tool we're using to judge, our own personal sense of right and wrong, is itself flawed. It's polluted. The moment we put ourselves in the judge's seat and try to measure God, we're basically trying to measure a perfectly straight line with a crooked ruler. It just doesn't work.
So, if our context is limited and our judgment is flawed, where do we go from here? How do we unlock this whole dilemma? Well, the sources we're looking at propose a pretty radical idea. The answer isn't actually found in the Old Testament at all. It's found in the New.
The cross of Jesus is presented as the ultimate game changer. It's the one event that completely reframes everything that came before it. You can think of it like a cognitive reset button. It lets us go back and see all of God's actions, even the ones that seem the harshest, in a totally new and revealing light.
So let's break this down. The logic goes like this. First, God's justice is constant. It never changes. Sin has a consequence, and it has to be dealt with. That's true in Genesis, and it's true today. Second, God's incredible love provides the way out by paying the price for that sin. And third, and this is the part that should just stop us in our tracks, the same judge who demanded the price becomes the sacrifice to pay it.
And when you start to see it that way, the argument is that you're not looking at two different gods at all. You're looking at one God with one consistent character whose perfect justice and perfect love are woven together through the entire story from beginning to end.
Okay, but that brings up a really obvious question, doesn't it? If God hasn't changed, why do his actions seem so different today?
Why aren't we seeing those same kinds of sweeping judgments right now?
The explanation comes down to the timeline of salvation. You see, before the cross, many of God's severe actions were about protecting his unfolding rescue plan for humanity. Anything that threatened that plan was dealt with decisively. But now, after the cross, the mission is accomplished. The rescue has been made. So now we're in an age of grace, not because God is different, but because he is patiently waiting, giving everyone a chance to turn to him.
Ultimately, the entire story, from the very first page to the very last, is presented as the story of one God. Not a cruel God who somehow became kind, but a single, consistent God whose full character is finally and completely revealed in the person of Jesus.
And that brings us right here to the central conclusion of it all. It's this: both the Old and New Testaments reveal his righteousness and his love. He is an unchanging God, and his justice and his love are perfectly united and displayed at the cross. It is right there, at the cross, that the stern judge of the Old Testament and the loving Savior of the New are shown to be one and the same. So I'll leave you with this to think about. The idea isn't to ignore those difficult, troubling parts of the story, but maybe to try rereading them, to see them not as isolated acts of cruelty, but as pieces of a much larger story that only finds its true meaning, its reset button, in the incredible, reconciling act of the cross. It's a huge shift in perspective to consider.